Good morning. Good morning to all the participants, and welcome to the first webinar session of the ESPON e-learning on the TIA tool. My name is André Henriques. I work for Innova, and today my task will be to ensure that all the technical coordination of the webinar and your questions and answers will be managed and run smooth during this webinar. So this webinar will be presented by Mr. Bernd Schuh. He's an expert on the ESPON TIA tool, and he will moderate both sessions today and Friday. So before we start, let me just share a bit of some technical details and technical instructions for the webinar. You can see already a presentation with these instructions that we shared before, and it's also shared in the platform of the webinar right now. So we would kindly ask you to check that all your system requirements are working fine to avoid any connection issues during the webinar. Please test your computer audio. If you have some issue, you can also use your telephone if you prefer. In the platform, you have a list of phone numbers that you can use to call directly and join the webinar by phone if you prefer. So we are now starting the content at 10:15 more or less. So please be checked that your computer speakers or headsets are perfectly fine and working. From our side, we really try to check everything and to assure that no technical issues will affect this webinar. We have already more than 60 attendees, so please consider that we cannot provide individual technical assistance during the webinar, but you have these webinar instructions that can help you to proceed with any issues you might have. So one question also, we are very happy to have today such a large number of attendees in this webinar. We have more than 120 registered participants. We have, for the moment, 62 attendees. Probably people are still joining during these last few minutes before we start. Just an overview of all the participants. We have currently around 50% of policymakers or representatives from public institutions. We have around 25% of participants from the academic sector, researchers, and 25% from the private sector or other entities. So in a few minutes, I will give the floor to the presenter of this webinar, Mr. Bernd Schuh. But I would like to share with you also that we have already participants from Portugal, Italy, Romania, Greece, Spain, Poland, Cyprus, France, Croatia, Bulgaria, Belgium, and Greenland. So during the webinar, we'll take around 1 hour of presentation and then a bit 15 minutes of questions and answers. But please feel free to ask your questions during the. So on your right side of your screen, you have an orange arrow that you can open. So if you have any questions that you would like to be answered during the webinar, please write them in the questions option on your right side of your screen. And when we have around 5-6 questions, we will communicate that to Bernd Schuh, and we will interrupt to answer your questions during the webinar. If not, please save it for the final part of the webinar for the questions and answers. So during the webinar itself, I will present your questions by myself to be more efficient during the presentation. During the questions and answers, I will unmute your microphone because they are per definition mute during the presentation, but I will unmute during the questions and answers so that you can ask directly your questions, okay? This webinar is supposed to finish no later than 12 CET, but based on the agenda at 11:30 it should be finished. by the end of this session, we are also going to share with you a feedback form that you would really like to ask you to use 2 minutes of your time to complete it, because it would be very helpful for us to get your feedback and to improve for the next sessions. So welcome again. I will right now give the floor to the presenter and the expert on the TIA tool, Bernd Schuh, that will moderate this webinar. I hope everything goes smooth and that we reach your expectations with this session and also the Friday session. Mr. Bernd Schuh will present also in more detail the content of each of these sessions. And welcome again, and thank you for your participation.
Yeah, thanks, Andre. And yeah, a very warm welcome from very cold Vienna. I am happy to be the presenter today for this webinar. As was pointed out by Andre, the main purpose of the 2 sessions today and on Friday will be to get you familiar with a tool which was developed actually quite a while ago for the ESPON EGTC, which is called the ESPON TIA Quick Check. This tool is per definition an online decision-making or decision support tool with a very strong GIS component, with a very strong mapping component in it, and it was developed and intended to be used as an ex-ante checking or quick check device for legislative proposals and legislative work on the EU scale. As I said, it's not very new. It was in the first time. It was already developed actually several years ago. However, I have already to apologize. You will not be seeing the latest version of it. I mean, throughout the years we have been further developing the tool, and we are right now in the stage of creating the, let's say, ESPON TIA Quick Check 02 version, which will be online later on this year. But I will still show you the version which is right now still available at the ESPON homepage. And as a matter of fact, the TIA tool is an open source tool which can be used by everybody. You just simply have to go to the ESPON homepage, and I will provide you with the link then in the end of my presentation, where you can also hook onto the tool. You just simply have to register with ESPON, and then you have free access to the tool itself as well. As Andreas pointed out, I'll just give you as a starter, I will give you a brief overview what you are going to see these 2 sessions. Today I am entirely devoted to showing you the tool itself, the background, the functionalities as they are. And on Friday, we will be switching over to the bloody stories, so to say, meaning I will show you a couple of applications which we already did with the TIA Quick Check. As I said, it's a tool which has been around for quite a while, and we have been privileged enough that both the Committee of the Regions and the General Directorate for Regional Development at the Commission found the tool very useful, and we are happy that in the meantime it has been found entry into the Better Regulation Guidelines toolbox as an example for an application within the ex-ante assessment process of any legislative proposal. And within this, we have already tried, or we have already applied the tool in the version I'm going to present you for at least 3 legislative proposals in the last year, which thankfully also passed already the scrutiny board, which means that it seemed to be, or it was deemed to be, appropriate to be used in the ex-ante assessment process, and seems to be now an established methodology for territorial impact assessments within the ex-ante assessment process of any legislative proposal within the EU. Which makes us pretty proud, but it's also, of course, somehow a request for further improving the whole exercise. And I will show you on Friday some of these examples of the how it really practically was applied then. But for today, I am going to show you, and I will certainly not use the full hour to do that, but be much more brief. To show you a little bit what was done and what you have to envisage in terms of what this tool is about, what is the methodological background, and what are the simple steps in it. As I already told you, the tool has actually been around since 2013 already, when we started with the first TIA project for ESPON, and it's at that time it was still called the TIA Arts project, and it was by then that we developed that in the first place. We had then several partners from all over Europe, Politecnico Milano, then the environmental agency in Holland, then the colleagues from OTB in Delft, as well as several other partners like Spatial Foresight. And then in the second stage, after that, after 2014, we were requested to develop it even further and put it on a web base, which we did together with, at that time, IDICO, which was the second TIA project, so to say. And then from that time onwards, it was actually called the TIA Quick Check, and it's now under this heading where you can find it also under the ESPON homepage as an online tool in a way. The main let's say request from the outset was that it's supposed to be a very quick and dirty way to check legislative proposals ex ante with respect to their territorial impacts on various types of territories. In the beginning, this was foreseen on a territorial scale, which was supposed to be NUTS 2. In the meantime, we have far more granulated the analysis, and we are happy to say that we are now at the NUTS 3 level, which is already pretty small and which gives you already a very good idea about the different territorial settings all over Europe. What is the background? The background is pretty straightforward. The whole tool is relying on the so-called vulnerability concept. A lot of you probably will be familiar with this concept from the ecology and climate change setting. Actually, it's also was widely used in the systems theory basis, where you say, okay, in ecology you have a system, and this system is on the one hand exposed to something like external influences. Take, for instance, I don't know, a lake or something, which is of course exposed, which is an ecological system in itself, but it is of course exposed to emissions from everywhere. It is exposed to inflows from river basins, for instance, and so on and so forth. And the way this system is actually capable of dealing with these external influences is defined by its own territorial, by its own sensitivity. Which is the system inherent trait which enables it to react or to adapt to different settings. We know from ecology that the system is then, or the model is very often then enlarged by the so-called adaptive capacity. We use, for a simplified version here, the regions as a system, region being NUTS3. And we define, on the one hand, the exposure as the policy which is imposed on it, so to say, in this ex ante way. So any legislative proposal, be it a regulation, be it a directive, or be it any other piece of legislation, is then to be deemed as the exposure, which pretty much equally is hitting regions all over Europe. I mean, of course, we know that within the directive case, this might be different from member state to member state, but in principle, still the exposure is there all over Europe. On the other hand, you have then the regions themselves as the systems as to be analyzed. And of course, they are kind of equipped with a certain inherent sensitivity. The sensitivity, as I said, is the inherent traits these regions show, and these traits are broadly defined with a large set of indicators ranging from economics over social affairs to environment to governance issues. And so to say, the product from exposure to sensitivity will then result into the so-called territorial impact, which will be then quantified and calculated for each NUTS3 region. However, of course, the exposure side is not to be, as we are talking here about ex ante assessments, will not to be, let's say, quantified in a way like saying, okay, I know exactly what the potential, let's say, influence of the policy will be. We can hardly say that in an ex ante stage of a legislative proposal. So therefore, here on the exposure side, we have said that it can only be assessed through, well, hopefully the best possible expert judgment we can find, and this is how we were setting up the whole tool then in 9 steps. Meaning that in principle we start off and define first the setting of the conceptual let's say frame. Meaning, and this will be much clearer when you see, for instance, some examples. But in principle, when you think about legislative processes in the EU, but also on the member state level, doesn't matter. We start off with, let's say, scenarios. We start off with variants of political acting, and these variants are very often then tested and said, okay, well, yeah, we are kind of best compromise solutions. And in the ideal case with a TIA, you are already testing one, let's say, compromise solution, or let's say 1 or 2 compromise solutions, which are still under debate. But these compromise solutions are already pretty well defined in terms of their, let's say, potential consequences of the piece of legislation itself. So when you start, you define these systemic borders, so to say, in terms of the potential consequences of the legislative proposal. And with this picture in mind, and very often this picture is then actually presented and created by the legislators themselves. In our case, in most of the cases, this is presented by the experts of the line DGs, which are already discussing or which are already designing the policy in place. And this is the starting point of a workshop where you run the TIA session in 1 day. The first step is then the so-called conceptual model. I will go into detail then later on what this means, where the group actually, again, defines very closely already the systemic interlinkages and causal chains which are due to the the legislative proposal at hand. Next step is then that you define, or you find out or define whether there are different types of regions differently affected actually, or expected to be affected actually. Give you an example, for instance, if you deem that, for instance, you have a legislative proposal on the steel industry, on environmental effect of the steel industry, it is quite obvious, of course, that, for instance, regions depending strongly on steel industries, either through steel production or further on processing steel, will be, of course, differently affected than, let's say, the rest of Europe. And then it makes sense, of course, to already filter out these type of regions right from the outset, when we deem that the effects, so to say, of any legislative proposal will be different in these types. Next step is then the real deal, so to say, is the assessment of the intensity of exposure. And as I said, this is an expert judgment. We are doing that in a voting exercise in a way, so that we don't have to kind of deal with group decisions or let's say ultimate harmonization of votes, but we simply collect the votes and process it in the tool. And with these inputs of the judgments of the votes, the tool itself then processes and calculates, on the basis of the sensitivity of each of the regions, the territorial impact, which is an underlying matrix within the tool, which simply multiplies the intensity of the exposure with the sensitivity in place, and then for each of the indicators calculates then an impact and draws this in a map. I will show you examples for that. And this map then is showing then which regions will be hit in which fields, to what extent actually. And then start the three most important parts in the whole exercise actually, because then you have to feed it back to the decision-making group. And you have to go for a robustness check. Of course, you have to discuss with the audience in the workshop itself, but then also with the wider audience of the legislators. Do these results make sense? Do you think that this is reasonable after all? And in many cases, they will say, no, this is not reasonable, or this is not really hitting the right points here. And then you go back to start over again, maybe with point 3, where you say, okay, well then maybe we haven't identified the right regions, or we haven't identified the right indicators in order to depict what exactly my intended effects or unintended effects might be. So this is then a feedback loop which is then run very often. And if we then find somehow a common sense and a common understanding on the potential effects, this means then that you are going then for the policy implications, starting a discussion. Okay, what kind of lessons do we then learn in terms of territorial effects by the legislative proposal? Do we have then to adopt or adapt the proposal itself? And what do we make out of it? And finally, last step in the process is how do we communicate the results to the general public, or in our case, as I mentioned within the ex-ante assessment procedures, is then how do we produce a report out of this, which is then up to the standards and can pass then in the end as part of the impact assessment process, the scrutiny board check. So I start off with showing some details. The first one is, what is the conceptual model about? In principle, this is a very, this is the fun part, so to say, in the whole exercise. It's a group brainstorming, nothing else, nothing more, in terms of defining systemic linkages by a group discussion and a group brainstorming, by kind of pinning down, okay, what might be potential effects on a specific territory, and this is where you have to reel in the participants and tell them, okay, you have to focus on regional aspects actually, which is very often not that easy, and to identify them in a catchword way, so to say, and draw pictures and systemic interlinkages with intended and cross effects between these sectors. And normally we kind of pin it up on the 4 dimensions of the environment, the social sphere, the economy, and governance. And it should depict, let's say, also the indirect effects, and is then, as I said, broken down in thematic fields. The end of this exercise is then that we bring in suggestions for potential indicators how to capture then these effects, because you can imagine, of course, the effects start out very general very often, then they get a little bit more precise, of course. However, still they are then not, depending of course on the thematic field of the legislative proposal itself, they are very often very, very specific. And it's very difficult very often to identify exactly a first best indicator for depicting things. I'll give you an example. I mean, we had severe problems, for instance, in the discussion we had on the abandonment of the milk quotas in Europe. We had a TIA session on that in the Committee of the Regions. And it was kind of astonishing to see that, of course, the first best indicator, of course, one of the first best indicators would have been to depict, of course, the location of dairy processing plants in Europe, like dairies. The problem is you don't have these kind of data. You're kind of astonished to see that even in our well-equipped FIDN databases and everywhere you look up in Eurostat, you wouldn't find the exact location of dairies all over Europe on a NUTS 3 scale. And therefore, of course, we were kind of helpless there in a way what kind of indication could be then presented for like, for instance, milk processing. But you see from these detailed questions which come up then, this is already a very excellent way to identify also for the participants and for the legislators, where exactly do I need additional information in order to find out, okay, what kind of impacts are to be envisaged. So in the end, you end up with a set of indicators which are then deemed by the group of experts as relevant and appropriate to be used. And as I said before, you are then starting to vote on these indicators, meaning that each expert provides you is provided with a voting card on each of the indicators, and they simply tick off what kind of exposure is to be expected, or what kind of effect is to be expected. And the effect ranges actually on a Likert scale from highly positive or highly favorable effects to highly unfavorable effects on the other hand. And with this voting, which is then fed into the tool itself, you then get finally, as I said, by computing it with the sensitivity of the regions themselves, you get then maps like this, what you can see here, with, in this case, a very highly negative impact on specific kind of regions. In this case, this was actually the milk quota session where we had the indicator on, what was that? That was, I think, one of the, that was, for instance, I think it was economic performance, so measured in GDP or something. So in principle, you get let's say directions, and you get idea about which regions and which type of regions will be hit most, in a way. In our case here, we were, of course, only concentrating, and this is the reason why so much of the European territory is not depicted at all, is we were concentrating on the rural regions, and I think even on rural regions with a high share of dairy farming in there. And this means that, of course, we had only, first of all, a concentration on a specific type of regions, and then, of course, we also get an idea which kind of regions will be hit hardest, and which ones are not going to be, or be less affected in a way. This gives already a certain pattern, of course, of territorial impacts, and is not, and this is to be pointed out very, very strongly, is not the ultimate truth which region is really going to be hit in which way, in a quantified way. It gives you a direction. It says that, for instance, in this picture, you can see that it's rather the peripheral regions, milk-producing regions, which will be hit more than, let's say, core areas of Europe itself. And that's pretty much it. We cannot now, of course, explain why exactly this is, especially not in terms of, as I pointed out before, in terms of equipment, for instance, of these regions, in our case with, I don't know, dairy farming equipment or something. We can't do that because we don't have the indication for that, but we can at least give you an idea, okay, which direction in terms of territorial impact the legislative proposal is going to take. So this is the result, actually. This is the starting point then for the policy discussion and for the robustness discussion, where you either say, okay, well, this is not really an appropriate indicator, let's go back to the start and find another one, or where you say, okay, fine, good, what kind of implication does this have for the legislative proposal in terms of territorial effect? And the advantages of the tool as it is right now are quite clear. On the one hand, the advantage is that you have a wide range of indicators at NUTS 3 level, which depict your territorial effects. You can also, of course, upload all your indicators you have and also various types of regions if you have the data for that. The tool allows you for that. And what is also important, especially in an ex-ante situation, that this assessment is not really based on a statistical model, but it is, of course, considering stakeholders' opinions. It's considering also judgment, which very often in statistic modeling is also induced, as we all know. But is very often hidden very much in the TIA tool itself. It's very obvious, it's very transparent. You can play even along with the judgments if you want, and therefore create, so to say, more plausible and robust pictures than you would with a statistical model. And the result of the tool is, of course, not only just a map, but it's the impact in itself and the discussion of data and coherences. So that's what I wanted to show you in terms of what is the tool about, actually. And you can see it here on this link that you can easily access it through the ESPON homepage. And what I'm going to show you is now a flavor of how the tool looks like. This is what you see when you enter into the tool on the ESPON homepage. I mean, you have to register first, of course. This is already when you have registered, and then you get a warm welcome on it, and then you say you start a workshop, and then you have again all these 9 steps which are already shown to you. In our case here, I use an existing one which we already used, which is actually which was a workshop with the committee of the region on the directive on work-life balance. So I open up this workshop, and then you start with it. So you can already add a description for it, for instance. But normally, as I said, the tool as it is in its online version is very often is not really one-to-one used in the workshop situation, because in the workshop situation you want a flow of opinions and discussions and not so much restricted kinds of core set through the tool. This is more for the documentation side and for helping you along also as an external user. So not to forget, then you draw the conceptual model, which is actually not within the tool, but you do it on a flip chart, as I said, and then you can, of course, you can upload your pictures and use it further on. And then the next stuff is then, as I said, is the selection of, okay, what kind of type of regions you are hitting at. In our case here, for instance, the participants decided that yes, in predominantly urban, rural, in urban areas, the effect of the work-life balance directive would be different than, for instance, for all regions. But you have, as you see, a variation of different types in there. In the meantime, I think you have even more types than is presented in this year, and you can also, of course, upload your own typology if you want to. So if this is decided, then you go for the indicators, as I said, and then you can select within a range of, first of all, you can also upload your own indicator, but then you can upload, or you can choose from a range of various fields. And then you can look into, for instance, social disparities, or you can go for the classic and go for environment or something. I just used, for the time being, I just used here in economic growth, but it was just on a randomly used stuff for employment. And we said, I think, for emission CO2, for instance. Doesn't matter. It wasn't really the decision of the group at that time. I picked it just to show you the effects here. And then what is then, this is already based on the voting. So to say, this was then, let's say, the unified or the group decision in this case, what the effect might be. And on the basis of that, the tool calculates in the first go, let's say, dominance relations in a way. So how many regions in Europe, not 3 regions in Europe, in this case, for instance, on the all regions category in terms of employment, it will be 30% of the, about 30% of the regions will be very highly negatively affected, and it will be 11%, let's say, lowly negatively affected, and 51 will be, or half of them will be at least with a medium negative impact, let's say. What this step is good for is that you can decide here, okay, what kind of maps will be actually relevant to be depicted. It will be, of course, rather those maps with a fair kind of distinction between the regions, and with a fairly, let's say, wide range of effects all over Europe. And this is what you take then with you for the mapping exercise. When just a second, take some time, when the maps are then drawn, and then you can again go for instance, certain type of regions which you have selected, like for instance predominantly urban, and then we pick, for instance, I don't know, economic growth as an indication, and then we see here the first results, and we can then type all regions as a comparison, and say the same indicator, for instance, economic growth again, and you will see then the effect this will cause. So you can then discuss and say, okay, yeah, for certain type of regions, I have then, for instance, urban regions, I have then a rather diverse effect, but a rather concentrated one in urban areas, but predominantly this is very positive. There is hardly any differentiation, whereas when I pick then, of course, all regions, I can see that, of course, the more peripheral regions in the east will be benefiting more rather than the Central European ones. And this is actually where you start then with the plausibility. So you discuss with the group each map and say, okay, does this make sense for you, or do we have to change parameters in there? And then you go for the conclusion question, where you say, okay, you go and write up some conclusions if you want to. Yeah. So this is the plausibility check can be done also then that you create scenarios in a way, saying, okay, my weighting will be different if I don't trust the first picture in the mapping, then I say, okay, then let's compare, okay, what will be changed if I change the weighting in the different indicator compared to the former case. So you create something like a scenario, and you put that here on screen. I haven't prepared that, but you can imagine what it is, and then you go for the final conclusions, which you, in the case of a workshop session for a legislative proposal, which is then going through the scrutiny board, is very important that you reach an agreement then on the conclusions. And then the final step is then a standardized reporting format, which allows you to capture whatever you decided. So that's in a very quick way how it is going to be and how this is working. And I would already open up with that the discussion with you, or the question round, if you have any. Thanks for the attention so far.
Thank you, Bernd. Thank you very much. So we invite all the participants already to write their questions in the chat group or in the questions option. And Bernd, we have already 2 questions from one of your previous maps. Can I give the floor to the participants that were asking those questions? So probably it's easier for them to explain exactly the content. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Fine with me.
So okay. So I will give the floor to Maria Prezioso from Italy. She has a question in one of your maps. So Maria, please, can you ask your question to the group?
Okay, thank you. Hi, Bernd. It's a pleasure to have you and this presentation. And I would like to ask you if the relation between the impact and territorial dimension is related to a specific territorial functional typology at the moment, or it's only an absolute value coming from the impact that you present in the map?
It is right now. It's a product, as I said, from the estimated, let's say, exposure, which is a subjective judgment. So this has to be made clear. It's a subjective judgment, and the sensitivity which is in there, meaning that each of the indicators you have chosen and you have seen in the maps. So I'll give you one example. So for instance, this map. So it is always the product of this judgment, as I said, and the sensitivity of the region in itself. And the sensitivity in itself is calculated as a normalized status of the region in a certain point. So, for instance, GDP per capita is then, of course, normalized now in this case in the former tool it is only set normalized, meaning, of course, that you are kind of squeezing the extreme values to the median. But in principle, it is a simple calculation from that. And this means that you get then a product out of this, and the product then defines, let's say, the classes of high and medium and low positive or negative impacts. As for then the typologies, as you were asking, Maria, the typologies simply just limit off, let's say, the sample of regions we are looking at, and of course the sample of or the size of the normalizations of the indicators, because of course if I just take predominantly rural areas, I'm normalizing only over the predominantly rural areas. It would be unfair and it would be biasing actually if you just calculate still with the same amount of NUTS 3 regions and normalize it over them. So that would be misleading, and therefore, of course, every typology means that it simply narrows down the full sample of regions which are compared with each other, let's say, in very general terms, right? So I hope that was answering the question.
Okay, thank you. I suppose that this is because I go over and I making a territorial impact assessment on the Italian NATS 2 case studies using also different typologies that are prevalent and represent the region, because the impact in my experience is different if you look at urban or rural or rural system, but you know well.
Yeah. No, for sure. That's true. But the differences you are envisaging for urban, for instance, this stems, of course, in terms of its normative direction. It stems from your judgment, right? Because it says, yes. I mean, if you deem, for instance, that in urban areas, I don't know, the effect of something is completely detrimental to, for instance, rural areas, then of course this has to be expressed with the judgment you are putting on it, on the expected effect, so to say. So this will be either highly positive and in the detrimental case highly negative, and then you will see, okay, for the different type of regions there will be, of course, completely different effects. So this is clear. One add-on I have to make in terms of the normalization discussion, because we are aware of the fact that, of course, you can debate endlessly whether a set normalization is really the right one, and we had also debates with DG Regio about that, who were actually pretty unhappy, saying, okay, if I have a decision support tool, I want to see extremes, right? Because I want to see in the future, in the crystal ball, where are my regions which are really most heavily hit, and then it's a little bit unfair, or it's kind of counter-effective if I set normalize everything and squeeze everything to the medium, right? And I cut off actually the extremes. So we allowed now in the revised tool, we allowed now for different normalizations. So you can choose now the normalization, and we put in the logarithmic one as well. So for those who are really the advocates for extreme values, then they pick the logarithmic one, and they have wonderful, let's say, extreme pictures, rather than the rather, let's say, moderate and let's say normalized pictures from the set normalization.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maria, thank you, Bernd. So, Bernd, we have a couple more questions from the participants. So now I will give floor from Portugal to Eduardo Medeiros. Okay, I will give him floor so you can ask your question right now. Thank you. Eduardo, you are unmute right now. Can you? If not, I can read the question. So there are two questions. Okay, there are two questions from Eduardo Medeiros from Portugal. One of them is if it is possible to add further analytic components.
Would the question would
I don't
be
know.
what?
Yes, I don't know if I
kind
can.
of analytical components.
I don't know if I can.
Yeah, I mean, there is. I can imagine. I mean, hi to Eduardo if he hears me. We already had a discussion. I mean, in principle, I can imagine what he means is, sure enough, what is now the absolute limitation. This is very often analytically kind of criticized on the tool, is that we put the analysis of indicators one by one. So you cannot aggregate, and this is why we are, and this is something we are advocating really very strongly, because everybody of us who knows about the dilemma of, let's say, decision support tools and the aggregation of subjectively created, let's say, information on a territorial basis. If you aggregate this by simply summing up, let's say, the strongly negative or strongly positively, or even strongly negatively versus positively, and then saying, okay, this is kind of neutral, then in the end, this would be outright wrong. I'm still saying that an aggregation over the indicators is highly problematic. because it would be leading to, let's say, wrong assumptions in the end. However, I'm aware of the fact that, of course, on the decision-making side, and we have been pushed very hard, for instance, by the Committee of the Regions, to include an analytical tool also for somehow allowing for aggregations. And this is what we are now working on in the new tool version, that in the end, something like a rough direction by simply saying, okay, this very region, for instance, in this picture, I don't know, this region in Scotland up there will be throughout the indicators, will be several times in a certain class, meaning, okay, it is several times that this region was, as a consequence of the judgment and the sensitivity, deemed as, I don't know, heavily affected, either way, positively or negatively. And this is something we can point out. But of course, with the caveat that it doesn't give you any absolute and any quantitative, let's say, result on what this really means for the region. As I said, these are directions. This is not an absolute value that, I don't know, the region in the north of Scotland will be really negatively affected in terms of GDP decline or something. It's not true. It's a product of a judgment and a sensitivity, or let's say a potential within the region, but is not an absolute figure. This is something we are also pointing out when we create these maps and put these maps in the reports themselves, that they are not at all, and I underline that 3 times, they are not depicting the truth. They are depicting a trend. They are depicting, they're giving an idea of potential, let's say, impacts, but they are not being the absolute or the ultimate truth. And kind of, I'm very relieved that even the European Scrutiny Board followed the idea and said, yes, we are aware of the fact that here we are not seeing any truth, but we are seeing trends and we are seeing ideas of potential effects. This is the reason why we are so careful about adding here additional, let's say, additional elements in terms of analytical elements, as Eduardo is asking, because he will agree with me that it's very delicate to create an aggregated result from strongly determined products which are based on subjective judgments.
Okay, thank you, Bern. I can see that Eduardo Medeiros is not online anymore, so I will give the floor to the next question. So I'll give the floor to another Portuguese participant, Teresa Fidelis, if you can ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting, and the tool is by far very. It has a lot of potential. My question is, well, 2 questions. One of them has to do with the conceptual model that I have explained. Mm-hmm. As I understand, the results of these maps are very dependent on the experts you invite to identify potential impacts. So the wider the experts, or the wider the representatives of the regions, the more accurate the data can be. Do you agree with this? Is it?
I know this is it's a delicate discussion, and
I understand.
And it's I mean, my personal opinion, it might be rather extreme. I don't think that it's so much a matter of being something like the super expert, and then all of a sudden the marginal benefit from the tool itself will be increasing enormously. I don't think so. I think if you take, but of course it depends on the subject itself. Because if I say, like, for instance, like the example I've shown you in the tool itself, I mean, debating a legislative proposal on work-life balance. I think here everybody of us, me, you, everybody on the street is actually an expert, because we all are affected by the work-life balance and the legislation which comes along with it. So actually that makes us all actually pretty much experts in judging on, okay, what might be the potential consequences if in our case, I mean, work-life balance was a very general topic, and you know that in principle it was about introducing minimum standards for maternity leave, for paternity leave, and for certain minimum standards of healthcare and payment during healthcare. And I think this is something which everybody can judge upon, actually, and therefore I think the marginal benefit of the super social expert is not that large. But of course, I agree with you that if you have a highly technical and specialized topic you have decided upon, I don't know. Let's take the latest debate we had, or one of the examples I'm going to present on Friday to you, for instance, the directive on clean vehicles, which is of course simply a procurement act on communes and communities and municipalities to be forced to buy and purchase clean vehicles in the future. Whereas, of course, it's a highly technical debate what actually is a clean vehicle. Then, of course, I agree with you. Of course, then the more experts you have and the more they are, let's say, representing different mindsets and also representing the different extremes of the, for instance, technical debate, which is around there. And I agree here. I wouldn't be an expert at all defining, okay, what is clean? Is actually then only an e-car clean, or is there also I don't know, hybrid cars which are also as clean? That's definitely something I agree with you, where of course the more experts you have on board, the better of course it will be then judged upon, and then of course the quality of the assessment will also very likely increase. So here but I would differentiate a little bit. So I want to shy away from these let's say ultimate belief of all of us that only the experts are capable of dealing with judgments which are very often something on the common sense, right?
Yeah, good. The other question, is the tool available for research purposes? Because I come from academia and I see a lot of potential in the tool. Are we allowed to use it and to put data and to see the results? Can we do that and to develop? Okay.
Yeah, no, just follow the link. I mean, as I said, you just have simply to register with ESPON EGTC, but they have, as far as I know, they have never ever rejected any application for that. So this is a freeware tool, and you can use it. As I said, when I do trainings on the tool, I usually encourage people really go home on a rainy Sunday afternoon, sit down with your family, and have a nice TIA. You know, everybody can use it. It's a decision support tool which with a very playful character, as a matter of fact, which makes it actually probably so sexy, because everybody can play along with it. It's not rocket science.
Thank you.
And of course, I mean, for sure, be welcome to use it, even especially in the academia setting. I think I also agree with you. There is quite some promising application cases in there, for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. So, Bernard, we have one more question from Piero Rubino from Italy, but I know that he doesn't have a microphone, so I will read it for you. And Piero, if you have any additional or question, or if it's not clear, please write directly on the chat and we'll transmit it, okay? So I will read this question. So he says, I wonder whether you are considering to reduce the role of judgmental yardstick in favor of more calibrated relations, such as adapting estimated equations drawn from applied literature.
Excellent question. Thanks for that. this is again the delicate balance you have to strike between having, and this was the original idea, as I always pointed out in the beginning, having a quick and dirty, easy to use, very transparent tool itself, and having on the other hand, of course, a more sophisticated, but on the other hand, of course, more precise in a way approach for territorial impacts on the other hand, which on the other hand then are less, let's say, user friendly and less easy to use in the beginning. I fully agree that there are a lot of potentials in there, especially with respect to creating or establishing interrelations between the indicators. I mean, as I said, the real, let's say, tragedy for everybody who is a little bit more theoretically apt is that you, on the one hand, create a rather sophisticated and highly, let's say, targeted picture in the systemic picture you are creating with the group, and then not being able to also depict, like what the question I think is referring to, not be able to depict then the interrelations between the different aspects themselves. Something like, I don't know, a system dynamics model or something like what you were suggesting, interlinear equation stuff. So true, yeah, it's an excellent question. However, so far I don't see a chance to let's say use the tool or enlarge the tool in a way which then doesn't cause it to use its let's say pristine and very let's say simple logic, which makes it actually so in a way sexy to any decision maker, where he said, okay, yeah, well, okay, I can see this is easy, I can concentrate on the single indicators, you show me then the pictures, and then I have to find anyway my way through a decision in the end. I don't. We have agreed with ESPON in the update now of the tool that we are seeking out for ways ahead, and for sure one way ahead will be that these interlinkages, for instance, between the indicators and the systemic links will be better depicted. So far we are here in the, let's say, in a phase where we are discussing options in terms of how to build it in, but the overarching dilemma saying you are supposed to create something which is quick and dirty and easy to use and transparent, and on the other hand having a very sophisticated and well-balanced modeling approach is of course difficult to strike. And so far, all the decision makers have actually agreed with us and said, yes, it's okay to have this first go with the tool here. And in those fields where we identify, okay, here we might have a problem, or where especially the explanations as of why these regions are then affected, then we go and call in the modelers, and we call in, for instance, the Joint Research Center guys and with their Romulo model and with others, and dig deeper and look into details.
Thank you, Bernd. We have a quick question from Piero, a quick answer to you, which is, in order not to face a kind of big bang, you might choose to go piecemeal, starting off from more consolidated issues such as direct GDP impacts.
Sure. Yeah. No, I agree. But yet again, I mean, if we then follow up on that, and I say, okay, well, I go for follow-up cascadic impacts like what you suggested in GDP. That's fine. It's okay. You can think about that, right? But again, it makes the whole applicability more difficult in the workshop setting, right? Because you would then have to talk about consequential effects, and you have to guide the participants through the ideas which are behind there. And there are certain ideas behind kind of a GDP consequential impact and stuff like that. So that's true. You can talk about that. It makes the setting a little bit more problematic, and it makes it a little bit more difficult. I mean, we have identified that, for instance, in the cases what we are also supposed to deliver now, and what is already established, is we have 2 more portals in the tool itself by the end of this year. One will be an explicit cross-border TIA, and the other one will be an urban TIA, with of course very different and very specific problems attached to it. I mean, take for instance the cross-border TIA case, where also of course we were supposed to include then indications and follow-up indicators, so to say, which are predominantly relevant for cross-border situations. And here you find that it is increasingly difficult for the general participants in such workshop settings to explain what exactly is, for instance, a difference indicator in terms of comparing 2 neighboring regions. Because, I mean, of course, you can establish then something like as I said, a potentiality indicator, so to say, where you compare the different statuses across the borders, and then the indicator just depicts the extent to which these differences exist, right? Being, of course, connected with a lot of problems in terms of measuring. Okay, what exactly is a neighboring region then? How do I define that? What do I do with not 3 regions which are not exactly fitting to each other? So numerous problems in itself in terms of computing the whole stuff. But then also we found out that it's increasingly difficult to get the people's mind around what exactly this indicator depicts. So the more complex and the more cascadic you get with the impacts, of course, the more difficult it will be to bring in people and to convince them that this is something actually which is to be depicted, right?
Okay, thank you, Bernd. I got a message from Mr. Piero Rubino. He says that he deeps appreciate your answer, and thank you for your rich reply.
Thanks. Yeah.
So I have just one last question from Mr. Vasilis Forkas. So we'll give him floor for his question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hello. Okay, or I can read it. Mr. Vasilis, are you online? I will read the question. So the question is, okay. So the question is, for the next session, it's a question. It would be excellent if you would build up a short example from scratch that will include the design of the conceptual model and its connection to indicators and effects. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I will. I can promise that. That's for sure. I will show you some examples, as I said, including all the steps which we went along, and you will see that, of course. Yeah. On Friday. Sure.
Okay. We don't have any further questions from the participants for the moment. So if we don't have more, I think we can. Bernd, I don't know if you have some final comments from your part.
No. I thank all participants who really stayed as long as this point here with me. So thanks for the attention and being online here with me and with us. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the second session on Friday, where we certainly will dig a little bit deeper in the practical examples. But I already warn you, as I said, these will be very specific examples. And the more general background know-how was presented today, and I will just have then the chance to show you how actually the tool is working in this workshop setting. So if you use it, or if you want to use it, like the colleague from Portugal asked, in a very academic setting, so to say, then I would already say it's sufficient what you have seen today. When you register and you go through the steps I've shown you on the screen in the online tool, that's fine. It's a little bit different when you apply it in the workshop setting, which you will see on Friday.
Thank you, Bern, and from our part also and from ESPON, we are thank you all for your participation. We are very happy to see that we have such a large number of attendees and interest in this tool. We have 76 online right now. So we really hope it reach your expectations, and we shall meet again on Friday at the same time for this more practical demonstration of the tool.
Exactly.
So really following this webinar after its closing, you will receive a feedback form that we would ask for 2 minutes of your time to complete it. Thank you very much again. I think we don't have really more questions. So yeah, so I think Bern, we can close for today. And if you have any questions, any participants, you can send us by email, and we'll try to answer them during the webinar or during these couple of days meanwhile.
Of course, if anything comes up till Friday, of course, then please don't hesitate to come back and then ask me. It's no problem. You can also send me an email if you find out some questions, burning questions after the seminar. It's no problem. Of course, yeah, I'm here.
Okay, so thank you very much again, and we can close the session for today. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye.